Excellent. Well, I love what you're doing. Thank you so much for taking a minute out today. I appreciate it.
Oh, happy to do it. We're happy to be on.
Yeah, me too. So, one of the things that really kind of shaped the landscape of relationships and love and all of that, so to speak, in our recent memory was 5 years ago this pandemic began. We were about a month into it, figuring it out. Everybody thought it was going to be 2 weeks, and it turned into what we all know it became. How much of your business and what you were doing was kind of revolutionized and still reverberates into your work today in 2025?
It's interesting. I mean, it affected everything, didn't it? You know what I mean? So I can't think of anything that wasn't affected by it. Certainly, in terms of my own practice, one thing that changed and never went back was I went to telehealth.
Yeah.
We shut down the office, as you noted. We thought, well, for a couple of weeks, then this thing will pass. Ho ho. And it didn't. And a couple of months, so I started doing telehealth. I had done very little of that before, occasionally, but very little of it. And I commented to my wife a couple of months in. I said, wow, I'm really liking this approach just for the sheer convenience of it. It was convenient for me. It was convenient for the couples that I saw. To schedule a couples appointment is easier if they don't have to be in the same place at the same time, no travel time, all that stuff. So, that's sort of like the silver lining part of all of this. It's like, well, now here we are doing these, everybody does Zoom or some kind of telehealth or communication now that we never used to do. So that's
Yeah.
really kind of cool.
Yeah.
In terms of the folks I saw, I remember noting just a few months in, I was noting it was an interesting phenomenon that some of the couples I had been working with previously, before the pandemic, that I might have guessed weren't going to do well under conditions of being locked down together, were in fact doing way better than I thought.
Wow.
And conversely, some of the ones I would have thought would have done well, didn't do so well. So what does that say? That was just further confirmation of what I've learned in doing this for over 30 years, which is I have stopped, at least consciously, I have stopped trying to predict how a couple's going to do
Yeah.
because you just never know.
Yeah.
You just can't tell.
It seems like betting on sports. There's just no way to predict at any given point who's going to do good, even if you have a good history. It's just it
Yeah.
can be turned upside down in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, yeah, because strange things happen. What's that? The black swan concept?
Yeah.
The that was this Nicholas Taleb wrote about many years ago.
Yeah.
You just something happens that you couldn't have predicted, and yet when you look at it, you could say, "Oh, oh, oh." Well, now we understand why it happened, but nobody could have predicted it, and yet everything turns around. And I've seen that happen with couples. We've seen that happen in the country. You just never know. And actually, a lot of the work I do with couples, I also have noted, and I've written about this in one of my books, I've also noted is very similar to the issues involved in trying to have conversations across, the political divides that we have now.
Yep.
There's a lot of similarity between working with couples and trying to find ways of relaxing some of our assumptions we don't even know we're making so people can actually start to hear each other and then maybe they can see if they can get someplace.
The irony of the miracle of love too is that with the black swan effect, the fact that it can go down is just as mystifying as the fact that men and women or couples find this way of finding that spark and falling in love. It's the
Yeah.
same sword by which we're either victorious or we fall down.
Yeah, it is very true. The longer I've done this, the more I am humbled, I suppose is the word. I don't mean to be sort of humble bragging, but humbled by the fact of not knowing.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, the subtitle of not my most recent book, but my snark. I have a book that I have a very snarky title. It's
Yeah.
called "It's Not About Communication: Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy Is Wrong." Snarky title, right?
Yes.
Well, my whole point of why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong is yeah, here I'm writing a book. Where do I get off saying, well, everything I know about couples therapy is wrong also, by the
Yeah.
way. I,
Yeah.
I point that out in the book. It's the knowing part.
Yeah.
If we think we know, as opposed to we have ideas, we're doing the best we can trying to synthesize them, but we never really know all of it because you can't know all of it.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating when you realize that because then you discover there's possibility in the very fact of not knowing. It's like, oh, there's another way of thinking about this that I haven't thought of yet.
Yeah.
And that's a very useful thing to be aware of.
So let's get to the heart and soul of what you do. I know it's very evident on paper, but if I put you in front of a bunch of fifth graders at career day, the kid in the back of the room is like, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" How would you answer
Hmm.
that child?
I help your parents get along better. That's what I do.
Yeah,
Now, not literally your parents, if in fact I was working with that kid's parents, I couldn't say that, could I?
right.
Uh, there is confidentiality.
Yeah.
But no, I help couples uh, who are having difficulty trying to figure out if they want to stay a couple, or if they want to stay a couple, how to stay a couple and feel good about it and feel alive, feel like it's worth staying together, and or perhaps to conclude that it isn't. But anyway, I help them with those conversations. And yeah, go ahead.
No, no, no. I was just gonna say, let's hop you into that time machine and go back to that age in your life. What was your dream? What did you want to be when you grew up?
Yeah, I think in sixth grade around then, I probably was still thinking I wanted to be a lawyer.
Okay.
Uh, I was a nerdy little kid. I am now what I like to call a recovering nerd with frequent relapses. So I'm still pretty nerdy. Uh, but I was a nerdy little kid, and I think very left-brained. I think I tended much more toward thinking I wanted to do this very cognitive and logical sort of work, which is what I thought law was, and law is to some extent. And it wasn't until I didn't even get into doing clinical work as a therapist until I was almost into my 40s. I started getting trained in my late 30s because I don't think I was mature enough and I hadn't been through enough
Yeah.
in my own life to really appreciate the beauty of that work, to really experience it as a calling. So back then, yeah, I was still in my pretty left brain phase.
There's some professions out there where you're kind of a jack of all trades, psychologically speaking. Like realtors have to know a little bit about everything. So do
Mhm.
lawyers. Lawyers
Mhm.
definitely have to be hip on what people are thinking and what just the entirety. And I would imagine getting into love therapy, every possible spectrum of issue would have to come up. So you're almost a love lawyer, so to speak, because you have to know so much and be able to tackle all kinds of different things.
Yeah. Yeah, one of my favorite analogies in doing couples therapy is improv theater.
Yeah.
It's a lot like improv theater, and improv is generally about it being funny. But we've actually had my wife and I do a podcast, and we've among the folks we've interviewed are a couple of different folks who use improv in their work with couples, or in their work with
Oh,
individuals, or in their work with organizations often. And they point out, you don't go into improv trying to be funny.
yeah.
It turns out funny if what you are is, and I'm paraphrasing here, but if what you are is alive.
Yeah.
If you're just, the one rule, as I understand it, of improv is yes and. It's always yes and.
Yeah.
It's never no but. It's always yes and. So whatever somebody comes up with, however outlandish it is, you go there and then you add your own perhaps outlandish thing. Well, couples therapy is a lot about that. Initially, the therapist, if we're not freaking out, the
Right.
therapist is in yes and mode. The couple's generally not. They're in no damn it mode.
Yeah.
They're like whatever's happening. No, damn it, that can't be true.
Yeah.
And the more we encourage yes and, it's like, wow, that's interesting that you feel that way. Even if, even in situations where somebody has done something that everybody in the room, the three of us, the couple and me are all agreeing, well, yeah, that was wrong. Yes, you shouldn't have cheated. But isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
Because let's start with the assumption that you're not crazy, evil, or stupid, which I generally start with that assumption. It's
Yeah.
been very, very, very rarely have I ever felt myself forced into the conclusion that maybe that's not true of someone.
Yeah.
But almost always, and I don't mean to be flippant about serious mental health issues,
Sure.
every once in a blue moon, I mean, a handful of times in 30 years, I've encountered folks who may be having a psychotic break or a manic episode or something like that. But the vast majority of folks I'm working with aren't crazy.
Right.
And they're not fundamentally evil. I mean, we're all capable of being jerks, but they're not fundamentally evil. And they're not stupid. I mean,
Yeah.
they're doing the best they can, like we all are. And yet end up doing things that are really destructive or painful or difficult. And that's got to be, the couples that do well are the ones that can be in that sort of improv attitude. It's like, wow, that is interesting. Painful, but yeah, but interesting. And if the therapist can invite people into that mode, that's when the magic happens. I talk a lot about the two sets of needs we all want in being in any sort of relationship are stability and intimacy. And most of the folks who come to see me are quite good at the stability side. The problems are on the intimacy side. And intimacy, I don't just mean sex. I mean just generally being present and honest and alive with yourself and each other at the same time.
Yeah.
That's scary sometimes. It's lovely sometimes, it feels great sometimes, but sometimes it's really scary. And the chief skill of intimacy is all about tolerating that anxiety because you may have to be saying things or hearing things that are kind of scary to hear. If somebody, I mean, something as simple as a garden variety complaint, if somebody's saying, hey, I wish you wouldn't do X, Y, or Z that you're doing, or I wish you do more of X, Y, or Z you're not doing, that's not going to be fun for most people,
Yeah.
especially if they've had a history where a conversation like that goes off the rails that raises anxiety and people just tend to avoid it. And that causes problems because then resentment builds and then any little thing can trigger, a huge reaction and that just sets off, it just reinforces a really bad cycle. If they can tolerate the anxiety of raising things that need to be raised, and again, not just complaints, but how about fantasies?
Yeah.
In the sexual domain that happens, but even in the non-sexual domain, like, wow, I've been thinking I want us to try living somewhere else for a year or something.
Yeah.
And I'm worried if I tell you that, you're going to freak out, as opposed to just, well, I don't like it. It raises anxiety. So couples that aren't willing to do that start to feel, well, that what are the symptoms of that? Either they fight about everything and nothing because there's all this resentment that's built up that they really can't talk about, or they go into a deep freeze, or somebody gets depressed, or somebody has an affair. My favorite metaphor is, the intimacy is the energy for growth, like a plant. If you plant a seed, roots provide stability, but intimacy is the energy for growth. If you plant a seed and then somebody comes along and paves a sidewalk over it, because after all, that's more stable to walk on, well, that seed underneath is going to try and crack the sidewalk.
Yeah.
And often that's what a couple will do. And so, like, affairs are often about trying to crack the sidewalk. Somebody getting very depressed or somebody just up and leaving is about cracking the sidewalk.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of the work is about tolerating the anxiety of going those places that they've been afraid to go.
Almost seems like acquiring the art of vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting. The way that we propagate the population on this planet is all hinged on love and relationships. All of the
Hmm.
songs, all of the art, everything that we adore on this planet, right? And it's the
Yeah,
one thing that we're not really taught. Like, you just have to go out in the world and do it. Like, there's all these arguments. Well, we need to teach kids how to be financially, fiscally aware and intelligent and all these other things. But when it comes to relationships, there might be kind of twisty little courses in college. But you talk about one of the most unfettered things out there that we aren't taught at all until we go out. No
yeah.
wonder why the failure rate's so high.
Oh, yeah, yeah. If you think about, it's funny, I hadn't thought this until this conversation, but if you think about high school, I'm suddenly cue the Paul Simon song, and when I think back to all the crap I learned in high
It's
school, it's all about crowd control. It's all about stability.
yeah,
It's like we're going to teach you how to shut up and get with the program. And I respect that. It's like, well, I see why that's necessary in a practical sense. But there's nothing in there about actually what does it feel like to be a human being and what
yep,
does it feel like to be in a relationship and how do you manage that?
hmm,
And it's similar. They'll have sex education courses that are only about the mechanics. They'll say where, what, tab A goes in slot B or whatever, but they won't actually say, what is this like?
right,
And there are approaches where it's all about basically just scaring the living daylights out of people so that they don't get pregnant. And of course, the scaring the living daylights doesn't work.
right,
It doesn't. It's like with DARE, the DARE
yeah,
program for drugs, right? Which has been shown to increase the use of drugs on the average, not decrease it,
yep,
because it ignores the fact that people do stuff like that, like they have sex and they do drugs because it feels good.
yep,
And if they're just told about the dangers, what they realize right away is, oh, these adults are lying to us,
yeah,
which is what we tend to do to kids. We lie to them to keep things stable.
yeah,
And we'll often lie to ourselves and each other to keep things stable. So, yeah, it is. We don't teach that stuff. And
yeah.
I don't know how to teach it exactly.
Right. That's
other
true.
than letting it happen and not
Right.
freaking out about it. But that's kind of a therapist's approach, you know?
Well, when I think about that from a musician's standpoint, I have a jazz radio show. When I talk to musicians, they can go to the Berklee College of Music, they can go to all these fine institutions, right? But it's not
Yeah.
until they get on the bandstand and they get with elder cats and legends and they just kind of soak in by osmosis. And it's almost that way when we think about love. Of course, we have our parents. And then we have all of these other people around us, and those are kind of measuring posts for us to say, I want that. That's what I
Yeah.
want to do, right? Or I don't,
Hmm.
the anti-hero, right?
Yep.
There's that whole spectrum of people, and that's how we learn. So yeah, how would you put a curricula together that would teach people the emotionality of something that's as mysterious and wild as falling in love and turning into a Paul Simon song?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I don't know. Well, and it's not that much unlike, I'm a musician too. I'm not a jazz musician, but I do a lot of music and I compose.
Yeah.
And that is among the most intimate experiences I've ever had in my life
Uh-huh.
outside of the sexual domain,
Yeah.
outside of being in love with my wife. That's very intimate. But other than that, the most intimate experiences I've ever had are playing music with people that are sometimes total strangers.
Yeah.
That sense of, well, you know what that feels like.
Right.
You're in the music world.
Yeah.
It is amazingly alive. It feels very alive. What you can do, I think, you can't teach that, but if you compare that to religious systems, systems of meditation, you can lay the groundwork. You can create the fertile soil where maybe it will happen sometimes.
Yep.
You can't. It's the same thing for people who have a spiritual practice. I'm Jewish. If I were to daven every day, daven being the Yiddish word for praying, I'm not orthodox in my practice. There was a period of time when I was more so. One of my kids is. You do those practices all as if by rote, but by doing that stuff by rote, by learning the skills, it sets up the possibility that every once in a while you have this amazing experience.
Yep.
It doesn't happen all the time, but you can make the soil fertile for it. And I think maybe that's what we could teach kids. And of course, that line from Paul Simon is reflecting the fact that a lot of what the way high schools are set up doesn't teach kids that at all. It's about, life is about, if you're going to be alive, you're going to have to do it in spite of high school, not because of it.
Yeah.
And again, I say that with considerable sympathy
Sure.
for educators. Both of my parents were educators, and my wife is a retired educator, and I come from a family of people who are running those schools and teaching in those schools, and it's damn difficult.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of sympathy, but it's also problematic.
Take me back to your childhood. What were these foundational seeds that were planted that have grown into you getting into couples therapy? How did this happen? How did you evolve into who you are today?
Yeah, great question. I don't know that I have a simple story of it.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, my parents stayed together. I didn't experience divorce as a kid. And in fact, it was almost like you didn't talk about it. I grew up, I'm about to be 74 in a few weeks. I was born in 1951, so I remember the 1950s very well.
Yeah.
And the circles I moved in, divorce was largely, you heard of it. It
Yeah.
was like, Hollywood stars and things like that.
Uh-huh.
And every once in a while you would hear of it. And of course, as I got older and got into the 60s and then the 70s, in my 20s, that's when the divorce laws liberalized and there was this huge spike,
Yeah.
is the sort of pent-up demand of people who were in miserable marriages but couldn't get divorced because the laws didn't permit it.
Yeah.
And that changed. And boy, you saw a lot of it then. But when I was a kid, you just didn't see it much. So I didn't have any particular relationship with couples therapy or therapy in general. Wasn't until I got into my 30s and experienced, I'm in a sec, I'll tell the story this way. I'm in a second marriage. And the story of my first marriage is that both my ex and I went on to marry wonderful women and we're both a lot happier. That's the story of what happened in my first marriage. So that was painful. We were together a very long time. We actually got together as high school kids.
Yeah.
So that was very painful. And yet that pain I went through and then experiencing therapy myself is what got me interested in the clinical side of things. By the time I got into the clinical side, I already had a PhD in psychology, but it was on the research side. I had a master's in statistics, and the University of Vermont didn't have a PhD program in statistics, but I had done my master's thesis in a very psychological area, so it was an easy, they said in the psych program, they said, well, you can come in and, you get credit for all that master's work because it was related. You just have to take all the psychology courses now. So I took all the psychology courses, got a PhD in psych, but I didn't get into the clinical work. I got clinical training afterward. And that was based on my own experiences of going through a marriage breaking up that was very painful.
One of the best storylines that we see in movies and everywhere is that moment where people fall in love. Of
Hmm.
all, obviously it has to be anonymous and confidential, but of all of the couples that you've been involved with, or even in the lore of falling in love, what's your favorite story?
Of falling in love. See, when they come to see me, that happened a long time ago.
Yeah, but is
I
there a
don't see
story
them. Yeah.
that was just kind of seminal where you're like, wow, that was a great way that happened?
Yeah,
Whether,
yeah.
yeah,
I'll tell you one about falling back in love.
okay, that's
Because
good.
that's what I work with, you
Yeah,
know.
sure.
And this is a story I often cite because I relate to it a lot, you know. This was a couple that I had worked with them for about a year and a half, and they'd done amazing work. They came in when they first came in. The wife had just discovered that the husband had been on numbers of occasions cheating on her. He had finally just faced the fact that he had an alcohol problem, clearly was not blaming his cheating on the alcohol problem, though it was a factor. It was lowering his inhibitions, but he wasn't claiming, oh, I never would have done it if I wasn't drunk. He was just saying, well, that did make it easier.
Yeah,
Anyway, so they were in this place and she was a mess and he was a mess. And it's understandable. I mean, she said she had lost like 30 pounds in a month or something. She just couldn't, she was really, really hurt. And he was a wreck and was in trouble at work. Anyway, that's where they came in with. They did this amazing work for about a year and a half, and this was pre-pandemic. This was meeting people in the office. They were then they had come back together. It was really beautiful.
yeah,
And they were about to leave town, so we knew this was our last session. And we were just reviewing this incredible work that they had done. And she turned to him and said, "Hey, you know what? Thanks for taking one for the team." And he said, "Huh, what do you mean by that?" And I said, "What do you mean by that?" And she said, "Well, you're the one who did the thing that you had to feel guilty about. But clearly we needed some kind of crisis
yeah,
because we are so much more in love now. We are so than we ever were. We are so much more." And she was talking about in her own life, she gets along better with their almost adult kids at that point. I guess they were like college age kids. She gets along better with her coworkers. All of these things that used to have her in this state of anxiety all the time, all of that was put in a different perspective.
yeah,
She felt so much better. She was so grateful for this. And I love telling that story because, first of all, it is a lovely story of people falling back in love, rediscovering each other, actually better than rediscovering. And I will say, in general, the couples that manage to get through a betrayal, they do so by having it be better than it was before. So when that happens, it's really cool because they're often really grateful for the crisis.
yeah.
So I just love that for that. And I just love the fact that, I always feel better. I mean, I like it better when it has a happy ending that way.
Absolutely.
I don't evaluate success by whether or not they stay together because I note that I wrote about this in one of my books. Evaluating success in couples therapy is not simple. There are three different opinions at least. There's three of us involved. Mine, the least important opinion, I would certainly say. But I've seen situations where the three of us evaluating, gee, how are we doing or how did it go, would have three very different opinions.
Yep,
There have been times when I've thought, gee, I don't think I helped you much, but they've thought, yeah, you did.
yeah,
Okay. There have been times when one is saying, oh my God, this is just what we needed. We're splitting up. And the other's not happy about that. So the other's thinking, well, this was a disaster. And the other's thinking, no, this really helped us solve the problem. And then there's, any combination you can think of, I've probably experienced.
So, of all of these career paths and all of these clients and everything that you've done and accomplished, even personally, ultimately, what are you the proudest of?
Wow. Yeah, I mean I do have a I was a statistician. I taught courses in data communications for a while I was building my practice, in therapy. What am I the proudest of? I think it's doing couples work. It's the couples work I've done it's the stuff I've learned from my clients. I think that's what do I get to be proud of that? I think so.
Sure.
because I feel like, I guess in terms of my own sense of pride, it's that I've learned how to establish a setting. I've learned how to ask the right questions, you know. I've learned how to establish a setting where that kind of magic can happen. I don't think I've created the magic, but I've learned how to make it more possible. So I am proud of that
I love
aspect.
that answer. It's amazing because I think about it from an interview sense, especially with musicians, the stories that can happen. And sometimes the musicians aren't expecting that certain stories or venues are going to happen, which is the nature of jazz. It's improv. You're
Mhm.
going in and you're going to deal with the mysterious. But I love that answer because it really is a two-way avenue. I think there's this popular perception that it's just if you're going into therapy, you're going to get this wealth of information from a guru. But
Yeah,
ultimately, at the end of the day, both of you are feeding off of each other. It's the human
absolutely.
part of it. It's just the way the zygote splits. It's going to grow no matter what.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's really right on. And I love the jazz analogy because that sense of, you know, what I'm facilitating, one way of describing what I'm facilitating is intimate conversation, including me.
Yeah.
We're having intimate conversation, which is by its very nature, I guess, kind of by definition, it's alive and it's organic. And we're all thinking thoughts we wouldn't have thought. Oh, I beg your pardon for letting that happen.
Oh, it's all good.
Um, we're all thinking thoughts that we wouldn't have thought if we're not in that conversation. You and
Yep.
me are doing that right now, you know?
Sure.
So that phenomenon I find incredibly generative, you know?
Absolutely.
That's where the growth happens.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's very much like making music.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, everyone has a perception of you. Family, friends, clients, everyone that knows you, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Wow. I try not to I try not to engage in hardening of the categories.
Yeah. Right.
I think that's going to be my next newsletter is talking about that. I didn't invent that phrase. It's been around for a long time. I don't know if have you heard that one
Yeah,
before?
I have. Yes.
Yeah, yes, I love that. You know,
Yeah.
so I try not to put myself in a box. Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean?
I dig it.
Um, I don't know. I'm this nerdy kid that grew up and also I get into the intimacy as well as the stability. You know, so I'm not quite sure what to say about that.
No, that's great. That's a great answer. So if anyone wants to get your books, do they have any questions, they want to reach out, they want to hire you, any of the good business, where do they go?
They go to brucechalmer.com, brucechalmer.com. That'll have, you can find information about my practice, about my books, about the podcast. I'll plug my podcast that I do with my wife,
Sure.
Judy Alexander. It's called Couples Therapy in 7 Words. I will even hold up, oh, I don't have my, there it is. I have to have my merch to show, you know.
Absolutely.
The cup that has the 7 words on it: be kind, don't panic, and have faith.
I love it.
That's the 7 words, couples therapy in 7 words. That's our podcast. And so any of that you can find information about at brucechalmer.com. I'm also on various social media. I pop up in various ways, but brucechalmer.com is the place to start.
And I'll put that in the show notes. Bruce, this has been wonderful. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your story. Keep radiating the love out there, man. We need it.
Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Hello, friends. Joe Dimino here. I just wanted to let you know that after 30 years or so, I have finally released my first book of poetry through the mighty Spartan Press here in Kansas City, Missouri. As the creator and host of both Neon Jazz Radio and the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino podcast, along with being a visual artist, I'm ready to embark on a new adventure and want you to be a part of it. You can get a copy online via Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and actually on the streets in Kansas City at the great Prospero's bookstore off 39th Street. You can also visit joedimino.com for links to the book, to more poetry, and everything in my world, including paintings. Thanks for all of the love and support over the years, and please dig the words.